Good evening, everybody. We're so pleased to see you here, and my name is David Plylar. I'm with the Concert Office and the Music Division at the Library of Congress. And it's my distinct pleasure to be able to introduce to you the Phaeton Trio, who are here for their, I think this is your North American debut, is that right? Yeah.
That's correct.
We've got Friedemann Eichhorn. Doing okay? That's okay. Florian Uhlig, pianist, and Peter Horr, the cellist. And so they are going to speak with us tonight about some of the things that we're going to hear in the program, and maybe a bit about their individual work as well as the work that they've been doing as a trio. And I think maybe I'd start with that, because I knew some of your work individually, but it was only recently that you formed as a trio, I mean, in relative terms. And could you maybe say how that came to be?
Oh yeah, we are great friends for many, many years. Peter and I have been playing around 15 years together in different ensembles, mostly in festivals. And we also live in the same city, in Weimar, Germany. That's why we like Mendelssohn also so much. But maybe later we talk about that a little bit. And Florian, we know maybe for 10 years also. And some years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, we had the idea to play as a trio, because there's this wonderful literature, and 2 of the masterpieces of our repertoire you will hear tonight, Beethoven and Mendelssohn. And so we are very happy now to be here in the United States and play tonight in this beautiful hall here in the Library of Congress.
Well, we're so pleased to have you, and with such an interesting program. I mean, your first disc that you put together was the Mendelssohn piano trios, correct? And so that it seemed like a natural fit to include that on this program as have an example of Mendelssohn. And so we'll get to that in just a moment, but we're going to be starting off the evening with something that's a very unusual type of thing, and which is a Beethoven premiere of sorts. So, he had to wait 250 years for this to happen, but it's finally happening. And this is I'm wondering if we could speak just a bit about the process of how this came to be. There's this trio that you're going to hear tonight that Beethoven began in 1816, and he took a stab at it but didn't finish it. And so it was recently, a completion was commissioned, and they're going to be premiering that work tonight. And so we're going to get to hear a partially, authentic Beethoven, but also a reimagined Beethoven from a modern composer. Could you maybe just say a few things about how this project came together? Or what made you think of this as something to do? I mean, it's a great idea, and I think it's wonderful that you're doing it.
Yeah, maybe I start for.
You have your own mic.
Magic.
So it's all set
Thanks
already.
For the feedback.
As I'm the cellist of the group, I always have to say some profound things when you're a bass player. Yeah, that's a very good question, David, how this all came up. Well, for one hand, we are already, for years and years, we are familiar with the romantic classical repertoire. And of course, different possibilities bring you to different reflections. For once, you can also play, for instance, on period instruments to get an impression of what the music is like, also the repertoire is like. So that's one way of dealing. But another way of dealing with music is also, for instance, to commission a new piece, a reflection on something which was already written a long time ago. So please correct me if I'm wrong. Within the whole project, we did just not have a commission on completing this fragment. We also had another contemporary composition in commission, which was a reflection on this fragment. So, but it's a new music. What you will hear tonight is also new music, but of course it's happening within the rules of Beethoven's time. That's, I think, very important. And for us, it's very interesting to have a composer's mind of nowadays who's reflecting on Beethoven's time. Into the process of composition, for example. And of course, with this fragment, we will talk about it more in detail, I think, later. It's not, it's worse than, for instance, the topos of the Mozart Requiem, because this fragment we hear of tonight has much less substance, so to speak. So it's very interesting what the composer has done in this respect. Yeah, maybe here at this stage, Friedemann can say a few more words to you.
Yeah, we got approached by the music publisher Hähnle Verlag, and the Hähnle Verlag is a German publishing company for music that deals always with the sources, with Urtext, and they have told us that this beautiful manuscript, this fragment exists, and Beethoven wrote most of the exposition of the work, and it was in 1816, as you mentioned, so it was his last attempt to write something for piano trio. And there are many speculations why he didn't finish it. It was in this time between 1814 and 1817 where he didn't feel so well. He was very often ill. Some people say that he had a bad inflammation, and so he was not really in the mood to compose so many things at once and couldn't work so hard like before. And when we saw that fragment, we approached the Russian composer Victor Kissine, who's very much in Beethoven's world, because he has transcribed the piano cadences written by Beethoven himself for the piano version of Beethoven's violin concerto. He has transcribed them for the violin. So, once more, it's not so easy. There's the violin concerto, the famous violin concerto by Beethoven, and Beethoven himself wrote a piano version of it. So he wrote another version that could be played instead of the violin with piano and orchestra. And for this version, Beethoven wrote a beautiful cadenza, while he didn't write a cadenza for the violin version. And Victor Kissine, as some artists have done before him, transcribed this piano version of Beethoven's own cadenza to the violin. And so we thought he's very much into Beethoven's music, and we asked him to finish then this manuscript, this fragment, that will be also then published in the Hähnle Verlag, and tonight we will play it. F minor, very interesting key also, says something special always.
You know, I should say just a couple more things about it. I would imagine that if I were asked to finish a Beethoven work, that might be a bit of a weight, in terms of, feeling that there might be some likely criticism to come, your way just as a composer to do that. And just to give some credit to Victor Kissine, what he's done, the introduction was mostly fleshed out, it looked like, and while yes, there's a continuity draft, as we might call it, for the exposition, a lot of it is just a single line going here and there, and some ideas that are clear, but not necessarily clear what was going to happen with those things. And so I think it's an immense challenge that he took on to be able to do that, just in knowing that, when one does this, you're going to be subject to this kind of scrutiny that one wouldn't if you were just writing a new piano trio, where there wasn't this kind of sort of a comparison to be. I just want to make sure that he gets credit for that. And so he even, we include in the program a note that he provided us kindly, where he just makes it clear that this is his just a way to read it, but it will always be a work in progress. So there's no attempt to say that this is some definitive version of what Beethoven would have done, but he's very much giving us a way to access this piece that was previously inaccessible. So that's kind of an exciting thing, I think, for tonight. So then you'll be pairing this with, it comes right before, and actually it's funny, there's a theme in the fragment, just from getting to hear it a little while ago, that feels like it wants to go into the kind of the immediate second theme of the Ghost Trio, the opening movement. It almost feels like it's trying to do that. And so I'm sure that you play all of the Beethoven trios, but do you have any thoughts about this particular one? This is Opus 70, number 1, from dating quite a bit earlier than the fragment.
Well, it's a wonderful piece, that Beethoven Trio, which is full of contrast, virtuosity. It's got an enormous density of different emotions at the same time. Now, so as we've been playing this for quite some time, and we felt it would be a very nice one to include here in our American tour, because it just tells you so much about Beethoven as a person as well. Like all these contrasts, the sudden ruptures, textures, and everything. And also, maybe above all, his peculiar way of interweaving the three parts, which is almost symphonic. If you compare this to Haydn trios, they're much lighter, where the texture is sort of, well, I wouldn't say thinner, but it's a lot more transparent. Whereas with Beethoven, you can really see how dense and how densely the textures are interwoven into each other. For instance, the role of the cello is a lot more interesting in Beethoven's trios, whereas you guys don't really get to play much interesting stuff in Haydn trios. All right, sorry. So, and that tells you a lot about also how the instruments developed. If you look at the piano part, sort of there's the way of how he transcends the possibilities of the instrument at the time. You can see that the range is growing, so he's got adding more bass notes, so you've got to go further left and further right. So the way expanding the sonority of the instrument with the new possibilities, because obviously the instruments changed massively around that time. You know, there were people in London like Broadwood who came up with completely new concepts about how a piano could possibly sound. If you compare those to the much lighter, brighter Viennese instruments, and it's wonderful to see how Beethoven has somehow put all these new options into that particular piece of chamber music.
But didn't Beethoven in particular prefer the Viennese instruments?
Yeah, he did, but yeah, I suppose as a composer, you're always, right? I mean, correct me, David, because you're a composer, but you're always interested in sort of testing the waters and trying out what you can do if you've got a different, sort of setup at your disposal. And I'm sure Beethoven loved experimenting with these things.
No, absolutely. I was going to ask about your working relationship, but maybe I'll leave that one for later. But
what relationship?
No, but one thing, I just want to pick up on what you were saying, Florian, particularly with the bass notes, just thinking about the central movement. So this is kind of a strange trio also in that it's got just 3 movements. So in that central trio, there's there's a lot of kind of very strange and unusual passages, but there's some in particular that are very deep in the bass with these tremolandi, tremolos just going back and forth between 2 notes to where it really creates this a feeling of indistinct, you're not quite sure where you're sitting, sometimes harmonically. You kind of know where you are, but at the same time it's a little bit unnerving. And there's something about it that strikes me as maybe I don't know, I don't want to say a new path for Beethoven, but something where he's emphasizing this sort of textural sonic sound world in a way that he doesn't always do, where it's a little bit more clear in other. I don't know if you have the same sort of reaction to it as an ensemble playing it, or if different thoughts?
If I do understand you right, David, I think you're touching the question why we always ask ourselves, why is Beethoven still so modern? Because you do hear things which do not sound like they should at that time, I think. So mentioning that, it also reflects on the more intellectual side of composition, I think, and he overcame already at that time the construction of a sonata form. I think actually he started to deconstruct it, what makes the later Beethoven, so the idea of deconstruction. Like in order to make the way free for real romantic emancipation in music, I think.
You know, that reminds me of there's a passage that Nicholas Marston, and that he has an article about this fragment, but he references Lockwood's biography of Beethoven, in which he discusses that period between 1813, 1814, and 1817 as maybe not a paltry area, but rather one in which there is this sort of a coalescing of understanding of where he might be going in the future, and that's he still at that time yielded the Opus 90 and 101 piano sonatas, the cello sonatas,
and the string quartet, Opus 95.
And 95, yeah. and Ante Fernergalipta and others. So he's still, I mean, it wasn't a slouch or anything. He was still getting stuff done, but it seemed like maybe this was and he was already kind of pointing in that direction earlier. So that's an interesting, that just made me think of that as a...
And I mean, in Schumann's perspective, the Ghost Trio is the first really masterpiece as a piano trio, or one of the greatest pieces, because he loved so much, Schumann loved so much the Ghost Trio and also the Archduke Trio, then the Schubert, of course, in E-flat that we all love so dearly, and then the Mendelssohn D minor, which he wrote Rave Refuse about. And maybe because Beethoven changed a sound world here in the trio composition. The second movement already, it's such a long movement for a second movement. Yeah? It's really incredible. And I mean, the second movement is why that trio is called Ghost.
Right. And you could read a bit more about that in your notes just to see why. I think it was Czerny who first said that. But so we're pairing the two Beethoven works in the first half, and then in the second half we go to the Mendelssohn, which, and in many ways I think is one of the perfect piano trio. I don't know, it just has this feeling of that's a piano trio. That's what you write if you're writing a piano trio, and at least that's just my impression of it. It just feels so right. But Florian, I guess I'm curious about your. Have you looked at I don't know if you've seen the first version. It's like he apparently had a version that he created that was not. It was much more conservative, not at all like the version that we know today. And in the end, he ended up making the piano part much more virtuosic and much more involved. And I'm just curious if you had any thoughts about that and how that impacts the way that you approach the piece, and I don't know.
Yeah, it's true. It's sort of almost like a piano concerto. It tells you a lot about what a fantastic pianist Mendelssohn must have been. Yes, there are a lot of notes in the piano, but I'd say the same goes for the C minor trio, which is different in terms of character. It's much darker, much more melancholic, whereas the D minor trio, which you're going to hear tonight, is a lot more bubbly and ostentatiously virtuosic. But I suppose the same goes for the other two instruments. So there's a lot of, despite the minor key, there's a lot of joy and exuberance in it, especially in the first movement and the scherzo. Yeah, and I suppose it's different in the way he approaches the genre of the piano trio compared to Beethoven. Also Mendelssohn was a fantastic symphonist, no doubt about that, but it's more genuinely written for the instruments, I think, whereas with Beethoven, many times you feel that it could have also been written for piano quartet or quintet or string quartet or whatever, or it could have been like various sketches or ideas for a symphony. But that particular Mendelssohn trio is really written for these performing forces, and it makes it very exciting to play.
Are these pieces that have just stayed in your repertoire since you've been around, or are they something that you've just come back to? Or do you feel differently when you do come back to it, or is it just a continuity for you that these kind of stay staples?
No, I mean, these wonderful works we play all the time from the beginning, because they are now like really friends at these pieces, yeah. So we love them dearly, and I hope you will like it tonight as we will play it. And it's especially nice. We thought, what I said in the very beginning, that we often meet in Weimar, where Peter and I live. We are nearly neighbors, and Florian lives in Dresden. And Peter lives in Leipzig, where Mendelssohn was working so long. And if you, once you are in Weimar, then you have to go to the Goethe House, because in the Goethe House you still see the original piano where the young Mendelssohn practiced on as a 14 years old. He was invited by Goethe because the families were friends. Yeah, if you go there, that's really inspiring. You see the piano, and it's young Mendelssohn sat there, and he was a real Wunderkind. And the special thing why we all love Mendelssohn so much is that he was this universal genius. Florian just said he was not only a wonderful pianist, but he was this wonderful conductor, composer, and he painted so beautifully also. And he was a great supporter of the arts. Bach wouldn't be so known, and Mendelssohn supported Bach all the time. And in his chamber music concerts in Leipzig, he always played the music of his contemporaries. He played his own pieces, of course, but from all his friends, he played music Mendelssohn. A great universal genius in music.
I should mention that in the library's collection, we do have what's called the Grabau album that has a Mendelssohn watercolor in it. It's quite beautiful. I believe it's scanned and actually accessible through our loc.gov website if you want to check it out. But we just, as a side, it's always wonderful to see composers working in the visual arts as well. We have some Schoenberg paintings.
I was going to say.
Actually, just across there, we have a Gershwin self-portrait and Ira Gershwin self-portrait that are pretty amazing. But that's a different thing. What other types of projects do you have on the horizon for the trio? What types of repertoire do you look forward to exploring next?
You did say something about the working relationship in this ensemble, right?
But it wasn't a profound question, so Peter doesn't have to.
Well, we've just done another interesting project with some more contemporary repertoire, which included, well, not so contemporary, Shostakovich's second piano trio. There was a piece by Wolfgang Riem, Fremde Szenen, Foreign Scenes, which is fairly new, very exciting piece, very kind of rhetoric. Interesting. There was Alfred Schnittke, piano trio as well. And in that program, or around that time, we did also commission that other piece, which Peter mentioned very briefly. It's a sort of extemporization or piece on a kind of theme by Beethoven, by German composer Johannes Schachtner. So we always try and throw in a bit of new music as well. And Peter's just mentioned this a moment ago. We have to put us back into that position where people like Beethoven and Schumann were, where the vast majority of their music making was contemporary. So they would typically perform their own pieces and those of their immediate contemporaries. And it's only now that we have the privilege of living in the 21st century that a lot of the pieces that we play seem to be part of a museum culture, because we just have to go back through that smoke screen of several hundred years to go back and research that immediacy of the creative act. And it's sort of a slightly artificial situation these days. That's why even with our solo work and all the various other projects we do, all three of us, we're always very keen to promote music by contemporary composers as well. And it's very interesting when you do, because you also tend to see a piece by Beethoven slightly differently. It's just another way of looking at things in terms of the creativity. Of course, we can't ring him and say, Ludwig, are you really sure about that sforzato in bar 13? Which we could do with people still around. And very often composers change things, but it's interesting to actually have that particular view of if Beethoven was still alive. And it just is a different chemistry of sort of working along with the creative act, I always found.
I would like to add something, because we are speaking about composers who are already dead for a long time. And I said earlier that at their time, there were contemporary musicians, and what they wrote, and even especially Beethoven, still sounds very new. I think for an interpreter, I just can speak for me, I would like to say, also with the experience of 30 years of music making in business, that dealing with Beethoven brings me often the sensation of understanding. And if you do understand something, or if Mr. Isaac Newton understood something about his research, I think this sensation of understanding is some deep feeling. It's difficult to describe, or it's not possible to describe in words. That's why we have music. And as I play this music, when I play this music, I do not feel any sensation of that this has been found out or composed a few hundred years ago. I think that's a very special, that's a very important feature of doing this in this work, yeah.
So sort of a contemporary activation of it brings it into the modern.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, I think I have another question for you, but first I'd like to see if there are any audience questions, if you don't mind, just to have a couple. If there are any questions, if you could wait for a microphone to come to you. My colleague Jay will bring one. I wasn't sure if that was a wave or oh, there we go.
Can you sort of demystify this fragment story, Beethoven's fragment? Where did it come from? Why was it mysterious so far? I mean, I didn't get it. Where is the mystery? Where was this fragment lost?
I mean, there are many sketches of Beethoven that exist. Many short sketches like a theme, or there were found just motifs, and but it's rather rare that we have nearly the whole exposition of a work there, and we just had to find out where this voyage will bring us. And Beethoven, I think his last trio attempt, I think, was in 1802 or 1803, where he wrote these variations, Opus 121, I think.
121A, yeah.
The cuckoo,
Kakadu, yeah.
Kakadu variations. That is a nice piece. And then from 1816, so having such a long fragment, that was reason enough to try to get a composer's perspective there.
And one thing I can say is that this is known to scholarship. It's been known for a long time that this exists. I think it's in a Berlin library, a library in Berlin. But when you typically get, if you look at, we have a lot of Beethoven sketches at the Library of Congress, and from the ones that I've looked at over the years, there are often things that without key signature. So you'll have an idea, and you have to know in retrospect that, oh, that's actually supposed to be, in F sharp or something like that, and that it makes more sense once you know that context. But Beethoven didn't need that context because it wasn't meant for public consumption. It was meant for, as an aide de memoire or something like that. And so there's a lot of these little bits and pieces that exist that scholars go through and they identify, oh, well, this comes from such and such a piece, but oftentimes these leaves are spread around all over the place. Hammerklavier is a great example. There's sketches everywhere, all around, and you look at it and you see this glimpse of what's there, but it does not give you a continuity. So what's very unique about this, as Friedemann was saying, is that there is a big chunk of it that's actually there that Beethoven did, and he just didn't get around to finishing it. He was also trying to sell it at the time. There's evidence that he was trying to sell it to a London publisher, but was unsuccessful. So when that became something that was a dead end for him financially, that might have, I don't know if that wasn't always his motivation for writing music, but it might have been a reason to switch to another project that was already on his plate as well, when that one didn't have an immediate sort of prospect for it. So I don't know if that helps a little bit, but there's another question? We've got two right up here. Just one moment for the microphone.
You said you're based in Weimar, and I don't know how long you have been there, and when did you start as a trio? Fairly recently, you said?
No, about 3-4 years
Yeah,
ago.
that's
Yes.
quite recent.
Yes.
Could you say anything?
Yeah,
Could you
sure.
say anything about your reflections on the development of musical life in the former DDR?
It might be difficult for us because we are all from the West. Huh?
None of you are from the East.
No, but we do live in the East, all of us.
Which is a very wonderful cross-fertilization.
Yes, you're right. There's a lot of literature already about what you're asking. How was the musical life in the DDR? But it's very interesting, as you probably have seen also on the news, that in Thuringia, where we come from, we have great political incidents, so to speak. But we are all from. I grew up in the West, and everybody of us did. And I think, personally, I live in Weimar since I think 14 years. Yeah, and I think you also.
Nearly 20.
Oh, nearly 20. Okay. Yeah.
Great, we had another question.
I had a question. And this probably varies from piece to piece, but how long does it take you to rehearse before you feel comfortable performing something in public?
Secret.
Oh, it's a valid question. We met up several weeks ago just to run through the sketches and to make sure that everything is right. Because sometimes you can have misprints or wrong notes, which I'm afraid to say we did find 2 or 3 places where we had to correct things, small accidents. And then you just put stuff into the fridge, as it were, and you hope it doesn't go off. And then we meet up again, and then we start again. It's nice to do something, this sort of creative process, to start a piece and then put it back into the fridge, as it were. I always tell my students, start working and they put it back into the fridge and you take it out and it'll get better. So that's what we've done in this case as well, as you do with many pieces. But yes, it is the newest piece that we have in the repertoire because most other pieces have been part of a canon, as it were. So we have already got it under the belt. But we did make sure that we start very early on to familiarize ourselves with the language because, yes, of course, there's a bit of speculation because some of it is genuine Beethoven, others is sort of reconstructive material. You just really need to live with it to get to know it a lot better, and then we'll just sort of see where the journey takes us. Yeah.
And what is so interesting is that you cannot go and listen to this music because there's no recording, of course. You can only hear some MIDI file, yeah, from the computer, which you better don't because it sounds so ugly. If the computer tries to sound like a violin or like a cello or a piano. So that's really interesting, and it gave us also the feeling how the people must have felt when they got the Ghost Trio for the first time. Yeah, I think 1808 when it was written. So they haven't heard it, and everybody looked at it at the first time. Yeah, and that was also interesting. Yeah, to hear some new old music for the first time while you play yourself.
And in the case of the Ghost, that was Beethoven at the piano at the premiere with Schuppanzig and Linke, I think was the yeah. Let's do one last question.
I'm curious to know if you've been acquainted for a long time and what sort of caused you to form a new group.
I didn't understand you.
Have you been you must have been acquainted for many years, and then you decided to form a group. And I'm just wondering, what the impetus was, or what event caused you to?
What made us doing so, or
Why we're together?
why we're together?
You ask that every day, right?
Yeah, that's
Nice boys here.
it's a good question. Usually, intelligent people say the question implies the answer. Well, why?
No, I mean, we are so fortunate to make music as friends. And that doesn't happen all the time in the professional life. And so we are all also teaching. We have chairs at the university, but in different universities. So we are much more than colleagues. We are great friends, and it gives us, to say this very something private, it gives us also pleasure to be on a wonderful tour like now. That brings us here, that brings us in 2 days to New York, to the Frick Collection, and even then to California next week. That's great to be together, and then that we may deal in our professional life with this wonderful music. I mean, it's a present that
Well,
we
still.
have our life from music. No, that's.
If I can just add, because I don't think, with all due respect, that you've really answered the question properly, because there's something, you can see there's a very peculiar idiosyncratic sense of humor running through this ensemble. And I think that's what ties us together. The thing is that as a musician, you tend to go to a lot of festivals. And there you mix and mingle with different people and stuff. So we all try different things. I've probably played with 500 violinists and 499 cellists, and the same with these guys. And then once you've got together for different concert projects and festivals, you actually seem to take a particular liking to some people. And these two, I'm afraid, are fantastic. So, yeah, we've basically clicked, and we thought, let's give it a go, and let's see how it all works. And so far, it's been a very interesting journey.
And it's also, I mean, it's so different when you meet in these summer festivals that all musicians that we also love so much. Yeah, you even go there with your family, and it's like a holiday time, and you work on a piece for 3 days, and then you play it in a concert, in beautiful atmosphere, but you will never achieve a real interpretation because it's fresh, it's everything is spontaneous, and it should be like that in a festival. But now, when you can work over years and you play for many years a piece, then you are nearer to find a language that has a meaning.
Well, I think we'll end there. I'll just add, though, that while they haven't been officially together for so long, what you're going to hear tonight is a sense, an affinity that seems like it's been in place for decades. So I think you're in for a real treat, and please join me in thanking the Phaeton Trio for speaking about it.